Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast fourth season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. This is an amazing episode because Brian H. Kim boards the mothership to discuss Gentry Chau versus the Underworld. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Kim. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, my pleasure. So, I always start off with a question of inspiration to inspire your love for music and who are your earliest influences.
Oh, I started playing piano very young. And so I think I was in kindergarten or something like that. And so my earliest influences were like things that my piano teacher was putting in front of me. So growing up, I was classically trained. So I played a lot of Bach. I played a lot of Chopin. I loved playing Chopin. I loved playing Beethoven, more the romantic side of things. And so I think that really lush, very flourishy piano style of playing was like my earliest influence. And then when I realized that pianists could also be rock stars, then I started really liking Ben Folds and Billy Joel. And so my high school and college experience was really, really influenced by guys like that. And then when I got into college and realized that film scoring could be a job, then I was really drawn to Joe Hisaishi, who did all the Miyazaki movies, Thomas Newman, especially his Finding Nemo score. And when Social Network came out and the Trent Reznor score came out for that, that one was also like a really big kind of, oh, moment. It was like, oh, film scoring can do this too. This is so cool. And so I think you've kind of swirled that all together. I think you get a decent idea of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think that's really cool, and especially that you're a classically trained a piano player. So
Mhm.
when now, correct me if I'm wrong on this, and I may because obviously I'm not a composer myself. I feel like the base of a lot of scores is the piano. Also feel like a lot of composers they'll practice or they'll kind of sort out the music through the use of a piano. Like, what is about the piano that is often such an important piece of musical scores?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think when you see, old behind the scenes footage of John Williams and Steven Spielberg, John is always sitting at a piano and sort of figuring that he as well is a pianist. And I think what's really useful about the piano is that it covers a really wide range of pitches in that 88 keys top to bottom. You're not really going to find that many instruments in an orchestra that are going to go lower than the lowest note of a piano and higher than the highest note of a piano. And so especially if you're well trained at it and pretty facile at it, you can sketch out a lot of ideas on a very broad canvas. So for me, when I'm sitting down too to compose, because I was trained on piano, I also always start at a piano, pretty much, just because it's an easy place for me to figure out the chords and the general progression of things. The only time when I think that's untrue is when I'm writing a guitar-based score. Just because the structure of the way the strings are laid out on a guitar and the frets is that if I figure out an idea first on piano and then try to translate it to guitar, it doesn't work that great for at least the way that my brain works. It's not a one-to-one. And so for something like Gentry Chau, which is a very electronic based score, that's really good to figure out on the keyboard because I'm going to be inputting that on the keyboard anyway.
Mm.
But for something like, say, My Life with the Walter Boys, which is another Netflix show that I do, that has a very kind of indie rock inspiration to it, and a lot of it is on guitar. So a lot of times I'll just kind of fiddle on the guitar a little bit to figure out the ideas for that.
No, I'm glad I wasn't far off. I wasn't sure that was just my imagination or something that was
Mhm.
definitely kind of like feel like a fundamental, a base aspect of a lot of the beginnings of composing.
Yeah.
And that's also cool too. So the guitar. So when when you're doing Gentry Chow, you it sounds like you're using a lot of also violin as well as other string, right? So
Yeah, there's the live instruments in addition to the synths on Gentry Chau are things like there is some violin, there's a little bit cello, there's guchang, the Chinese instrument, there's erhu. All of those are string instruments. So the solo instruments are primarily string instruments that sit on top of the synths. So yeah, you're right about that. And with those, I also play violin very, very poorly, but I do play violin, and so like there's a base knowledge of that And there are some things that translate with violin to something like the erhu, which also has like similar hand positions. I myself cannot play erhu or gucheng or cello, and so those things I will hire highly trained, wonderfully talented solo instrumentalists to do that for me. But at least with those, yeah, those have been really fun to write for this score, just to branch
I
out.
find that absolutely fascinating because I, I know it's a misnomer, but it feels like when you think about a composer, like you think, you must be able to play every instrument because you're using so many in your scores. How are
Mhm.
you composing pieces of music for instruments you don't know how to play? Because like you're still imagining the sound, you're still imagining a range of capabilities of
Mhm.
that instrument.
Mhm.
How are you doing that in the songs? Especially, like I said the I can't remember which the name of the instrument you used because I don't think I've heard of it before. You mentioned it
Things
was
like gucheng and
yeah,
erhu and stuff
yeah,
like
never heard
that.
of them before, like at all.
Step one is a lot of Googling just to be like, what are the strings and where does each string start and end and where do the pitches start and end and how many strings are there and what are the hand positions? Just because I don't want to hand an instrumentalist something where they're like, this is impossible, you crazy person. Don't give me this to do. And so the first start is that, and that'll give you sort of the basis of like just ones and zeros, what you can do, what you can't do. And then for me, I watch a lot of videos of it because I also want to know what the instrument sounds like in specific ranges. Um, because if they're very kind of dark and fuzzy in a certain range and very bright and shiny in another range, I want to know that, and that's something that I'm only going to be able to hear. I'm not going to be able to find that in like a Google document or PDF somewhere. I want to hear that for myself, and so. Yeah, and even with larger orchestration, like for, brass and other percussion instruments in like a 70, 100 piece film score orchestra, I have a lot of books and a lot of Googling just to make sure I know like where things start and stop. And that was when I was getting educated years ago. But now, having worked on these sorts of scores for a while with lots of instruments and lots of different kinds of combinations, you get your own sort of sense, just like a gut feeling of oh, I've worked with French horns a lot before. I know when they sit in this range, and then you double it with a trumpet in this range, it's going to give you a very specific sound. And so if you really want, a very adventurous Hollywood sound, you might double and triple certain things in certain octaves just to make sure you're getting that really in your face Star Wars or like Wagnerian kind of vibe to it. And so yeah, it's a combination of just like you look things up in books, you look things up in Google, and then just experience and figuring out like what colors really sing to you.
It's absolutely awesome. And the two instruments that you named, I'm not even going to try repeating because like I said I'm not
Yeah.
sure I can pronounce them, so I'm just gonna you know which ones I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So the score we're gonna be discussing is the one to Gentry Chau versus the Underworld, which
Yeah.
is while my wife is absolutely obsessed now with that
Oh,
show because
cool.
I was watching to set up for the interview, and so we were watching the episodes. My wife
Hmm.
is so obsessed with the show right now; she absolutely loves
Cool.
it. And the score is amazing. Me and my wife were listening to the score last night in preparing for the interview. And so my understanding of the show is, it's on Netflix. It's a Chinese show and with American influences as well. So are the
Mhm.
two instruments you named Chinese in cultural origin?
Yeah, the gucheng and the erhu are both traditionally Chinese instruments. There's another Korean instrument called the gayagum that I also put in there. Another Chinese wind instrument called the diqi that's also put in there. Yeah, we really wanted the score to be ultra specific. Like, just this is a score that could only really exist in this specific show. And so it's a horror show, and so we had a lot of horror influences. I'm a huge fan of films like The Ring, this crazy Korean horror movie called The Wig about this like wig that takes over people's bodies, like that sort of weird niche Eastern Asian horror. I really love. And so I loved taking ideas from that kind of sound design and putting that in the score. And like I said, all the Chinese instruments, and then we wanted everything to fit within like a K-pop language kind of thing because I also wrote original songs for the show, and we wanted the songs and the score to all feel really tied together. And so I would take synth and drum sounds from the pop world, and then sound design from the East Asian horror world, and then traditional Chinese instruments because of Echo Wu, the show creator, she is herself is Chinese, and Gentry Chau is a Chinese American character, and so we wanted to represent that as well. So it's a really cool melting pot of ideas that I think lended itself to a score that could really only exist for this very particular show.
And like the score is absolutely fascinating. And as we'll get to it later on, for those listeners who listen to us and are now super motivated to buy the music, it's two the I won't say two discs, but I mean I bought it on Apple iTunes, but it's
Yeah,
technically two discs.
yeah,
And the second disc is almost fully instrumental,
yes,
not completely, but almost fully. And the first disc is they'd be described as the musical acts, the bands
yeah,
and the lyrics.
yeah.
So when you're right, the musical act part of the first disc, is that
Mhm.
also something that you are a part of, and you're choosing which of those songs you're using, or or that's something that it's like, hey, someone else is compiling those songs for different scenes, and when did you determine when you're using the score and when you're using musical
Mm,
acts? And then the
mm,
third part of the question would be, um, are you when you're thinking about your music and also the musical act music, are you
mm.
trying to find a musical through line or a sound through line between these both?
Yeah, that's a great question. Questions. So the first disc is 12 original songs that I wrote for the show, and we wanted to be them. We wanted them to act somewhere in between a licensed song and a piece of film score. There were action sequences and really big dramatic sequences in the show that echo the show creator always wanted to have like big pop songs behind them. And while she was working on the show, she realized that if to get something really specific that she needed, she wasn't going to be able to go to the K-pop library, the K-pop page on Apple Music or Spotify, and find something as specific as she needed that had the horror influence, that had the K-pop influence, that had the Eastern instruments in it that she wanted. And so I was hired in pre-production before any animation started. And so I was writing songs just to the script, just to descriptions in the script. And so when we were writing those songs, I was singing all the vocalists, all the vocal lines, all the temp rap, all of that. And so we didn't know who was going to be singing what. We just knew what songs were going to be placed where, and what was going to be animated to. And so I wrote all those first before animation started. And then once animation was done, I came back and then I wrote the score for that's disc two for of the soundtrack is the score that I wrote for, which is like you said, primarily instrumental. There are some sort of lighter vocal lines that come in, but it's not like a full on verse chorus at like lead vocalist kind of song sort of thing like disc one is. Um, and because I'd written all of those songs first, the 12 songs, I'd really defined what the sound of the show was going to be pretty early on, before I even started writing the underscore for it. So when I got to the underscore, I had all of these tools and all of these sounds that I'd already built up for a couple of years. I was writing songs for 2 years before I started writing the score for the show. The score all took place during the final year of production. And so, yeah, I had all of these pieces talking to each other in my brain that I could just sort of pull from at any point in the score that I'd already worked on for the songs. So a good example of that is in the season finale, there's a song called Silhouette that closes out the whole show. And the melody of that song is actually used in almost every episode leading up to it, primarily in piano. There's a through line for Gentry of looking for her family, wanting to be a part of something, wanting to be a part of a family. She thought her parents were dead. Her great aunt was raising her. She moved to Korea because she didn't feel like she belonged in Texas. So there's this long running theme of searching for her. And whenever we touch on that theme, I use this particular melody throughout the whole season. And so I hope that when the song plays in episode 13 and you hear that melody come in like a fully sung song version, that it's really emotionally cathartic for the listener as it was for me when I was writing it and planning it in that way. And sort of going back to a little bit to influences of mine. I always really loved, in addition to Thomas Newman and the other film composers that I mentioned, I always really loved the Alan Menken era of Disney movies. Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, that sort of thing, where he's writing both the underscore and also the music for the songs.
Hmm.
He would have other lyricists working with him, but in Beauty and the Beast, he wrote all the instrumentation for Belle, the opening number. He wrote the Beauty and the Beast music for that famous song as well, in addition to all of the score. And I always felt like those Disney movies had this really unique alchemy in them, where you could tell that like the musical mind behind everything was one brain, like all of that. He was constantly pulling just from this well of ideas that he had, and everything really spoke to each other and felt really unified. And so when I was making the music for Gentry, that was very much like a shining, like a northern star that I was trying to go for, where like I wanted all of the songs and all of the score to feel like they coexisted with each other and they couldn't exist without each other. So that's my long winding answer to
Oh,
your
no, I really appreciate it. And I think I found it fascinating when you were like, you started writing the score before you saw the animation, because having watched Gentry versus Underworld, the animation is very interesting and unique in its own way. And I don't know, you can go as far as saying the animation itself exists as its own character, but there's
Mm.
a very specific look and language to the animation.
Yeah,
Um,
totally.
it exists. You can see the horror elements of the story as well. There's some definite humor that comes through the animation as well. The
Mhm.
animation looks like it both can speak to children, but also has like an adult little angle to it as
Totally.
well.
Yeah.
When you were scoring it
Hmm.
and then you saw the animation, does the look of the animation, did that have an impact then in how you thought about it musically? Did you go back and think,
Yeah.
once you saw the animation, that I need to make some changes to match with what I'm
Yeah.
seeing right here?
100%. Yeah, yeah. So for the songs in particular, because they had existed before I saw anything, yeah. The only thing visually that I had to go from when I was working with the scripts was the show Bible, the pitch Bible that Echo had put together, and that had some early concepts of what the show was going to look like, and so there were some sketches there and some character designs that I had some idea that, like as you said, what you said pretty much perfectly, is that they were going to toe these lines between children and adult animation. They were going to have really bright colors and very dramatic lighting. And so I knew that it was going to have that sort of that very specific look to it. But once I saw the animation, I got a sense of how of the motion of it and how the action was going to look and the speed of the editing, and how they wanted things to fall in time with the edits. And so with the songs, I very often had to go back after I'd written a song a couple of years prior, and then adjusted a little bit to how things were going to fall. Editing and animation are completely different crafts from what I do from music. And so when they get a song and I say, oh, in beat two, a minute and a half into the song, I would love for this to hit on a certain event that's going to happen. Sometimes it translates perfectly, and sometimes because of elements that I don't even know about when I'm writing the song, that time is not going to work out. Like maybe there was a couple of extra lines of dialogue they needed to add before that happened, and now my hit is too late or something like that. And so after I got the animation back, there was always a middle pass that I had to do of every song, just to make sure, like, oh, I need to shorten this. I need to make this longer. I really, really want this chorus to hit when this explosion hits, so I'm gonna have to shift these or change tempos. And so, yeah, that was a really cool back and forth that I had never been a part of before. I really felt like part of the active storytelling process when I was doing those sorts of edits.
And the other part too, going back to the style of the animation, and as I were mentioning, being something that can go both for children and then the adults. How much of a musical quandary that when you're writing your music, are you thinking in terms of this music is made for kids, this music is made for adults, or is it just the demands of any particular scene that you're writing for, or do you think the age of potential audience?
Most of the time, I'm just writing what I think is going to be the demands of the scene. This show in particular, Gentry Chau, we actually had to tone it back of how scary it was. And so there was actually some moments where I had to pull the music back because it was getting too creepy, or the boo scares were like a little bit too boo scare-y.
Yeah,
And so for this one, it was that was a constant sort of back and forth between me and Echo and Netflix, of us having maybe a certain horror vibe that we were going for, and Netflix saying that they didn't think that that would land quite right for the kids and family target that they were going for. Um, and it was this balance that we were trying to find between what we thought would be really, really scary and fun, and what they knew where the show was going to go in terms of its streaming, in terms of who they were going to pitch it to. And I think the balance that we found when I go on Reddit or when I look at comments on Instagram or YouTube and see what people are reacting to, I feel very confident that we found that really that needles thread. What is that? The we threaded the needle. That's the phrase. We threaded that needle of finding that balance because I think the people are reacting to it in the way that we really hoped that they would. But this is the first time I think where I had to really think about the age of
Yeah.
who I was writing for. Because most of the time I'm just like, yeah, I'm just going to do what the scene calls for, not really thinking that, oh, I'm going to be too scary. But this time I had to make sure it wasn't too scary.
But I'm gonna say I'm impressed with the ballsiness to go online and wade through the social media responses of individuals.
Yeah.
So I think I'd be terrified. I'd be like, oh God, I will say like even with like my podcast, I see a comment I'm like, like you kind of like
Oh
sign up.
yeah.
I don't know if I want to read it.
Yeah, yeah, I think I sort of I like dipped a toe into the water basically, just be like, I'm gonna read a few and just make sure that like people like it. And if
Yeah.
they don't like it, then I'm gonna stop because I don't think I want to read any more of that. But the people did like it, so I would go a little further and go into the comments just to see. I was so curious. I'd worked on the project for so long. I was just really curious what people were gonna respond to because I had my personal favorites of songs and of pieces of music that I wrote for it. And I never know if that's going to be what the audience goes for. We would try to guess while we were working on the show, like what were the songs that the audience were going to respond the most to. So yeah, for me, it's been really, really gratifying and yeah, heartwarming to see that these songs that I really cared about for so long, other people are having the same reaction to it.
Well, not my next question, but later on in the show, I got two Pacific songs that are my favorites. I'm going to ask you
Yeah,
questions about. I'd be very
sure.
curious to find out if those are the ones that you said that are your favorites, or they're different ones. We're going to figure out if we're on the same page on that one. But
Yeah.
first, I want to Jentry Chau, she's the character is a
Mhm.
16-year-old female who is learning about herself and her powers, or her develop or not developing or resurfacing powers as
Mhm.
these series continues. And she
Mhm.
has different powers. She has like fires that she can do. I think she also can bring back the dead. I think it was one of the other powers that hers that she mentioned, some others. Um, when you're thinking about creating the themes for Gentry Chow,
Mhm.
not only of her age but for her development as a character throughout the series,
Mhm.
which themes and which instruments are you keying in on to represent her, and does your representation of her change as she changes throughout the series?
Wow, that's a great question. We knew that when we wrote the theme song for the show, I wrote the theme song before I started writing any underscore. That was during the original song period. There was a little piano lick, a keyboard lick that I had in there that Netflix was like, oh, that's going to be something that you're going to use later, right? And I was like, yes, of course. That was my intention. I just thought it was a cool hook to put in there. But they picked up on that. And so there's a it's one, two, three, four, five. It's like an 8 note little melody that sort of came to represent Gentry's powerful side because the theme song is very in your face. It's very like girl power, girl group. We're gonna come and get you sort of thing. And so using a melody from the theme song in that way made sense, particularly when she's gearing up to fight somebody or when she is triumphing in her fighting in particular. So that was something that came really organically, and it goes through different instruments. Like it goes through some brass instruments, it goes through some synth instruments, it goes through some piano instruments as well. And so, yeah, I try to vary it a little bit. I think there are some projects where I would want to play the instrument in the same theme and the same instrument every time because either maybe it wouldn't come back often enough and I really want to make sure the audience connects with it, or maybe it's like really tied to that one instrument. With this one, I wanted to give it a little bit of variety because the theme comes back a lot and I want it to feel new and fresh every time that you heard it. As I mentioned with the song that comes at the end of the show, Silhouette, and there's a melody from that that's always used for the sort of family longing moments. There's a very specific piano sound that I use almost all the time for that one, mostly because I want that theme to sound lonely and I want it to sound very emotional. And so I want that to have that very specific emotional connotation to it. And so that piano sound for me really captured it. Um, in terms of other themes that I'm thinking about for the show, this we really use the songs as themes as well. There's one song called Do You See Me by an artist named Yeji. She sings the vocalist for that. She sings the vocals for that. And that is the theme for Gentry and Michael. That's their romantic theme. And so that was a really fun thing for me to do in that whenever they were having a moment together, I would just bring back the song. I would just get that hook placed in the right spot, like right when they're going to kiss or right when they're having a really specific line that is like really important for their relationship. Just drop that hook in there. It reminded me a lot of how K-dramas will do romantic themes. A lot of times in K-dramas, a romantic couple will have like a very specific pop song that is like their song. And whenever they're together, the K-drama will just drop that song in there. So the audience has a nice Pavlovian response to it where like they feel it right here every time that song drops. And so for Kit and Michael and that song Do You See Me, that was a really nice way to use that song. So yeah, I think, between the theme song having that primary theme and then that emotional theme and then the Kit and Michael theme, there's a Kit and Gentry, sorry, the Gentry Michael theme, there's a Kit and Gentry theme as well. Yeah, we were really just trying to keep track of all the relationships and all the specific emotional arcs throughout.
Well, the first thing I'm gonna talk about, 'cause I wonder if this is one of your favorite, because this was my favorite,
Hmm.
and it's one of the ones funny enough, at one point, 'cause I was listening to music as preparing for the interview, and I was talking to my wife because she was watching, enjoying the show. And
Hmm.
then I told her, listen to this song. And so she's playing it in the bedroom. I'm playing mine in the living room as we're both listening, preparing for the interview. So let me know, and this is both of our favorites, I think. Um, In the Great Beyond, which I found
Oh,
to be my favorite
yeah.
piece of
Yeah.
the entire score and first music part as well, the soundtrack.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. There's a serenity to it. There's a sadness to it.
Hmm.
Can you kind of break down how you approach that piece?
Yeah, I love that one. I love that you brought that up. That is one of my favorites. That's a very specific moment in the show where, a little spoilery, but the main villain, Chang, Mr. Chang, the reason that he wants to get Gentry's powers back is because he wants to bring his daughter back from the dead. He thinks he can use Gentry's powers to bring her back from the dead. Um, and that piece of music comes in episode 10, where he successfully brings her back from the dead, not realizing that when you bring somebody back from the dead in this world, they're a little broken. They're not who they used to be. They've been through death and now they've come back and that changes them. And so when he brings back Xiaolan, his daughter, she's not the same. And she goes on a destructive rampage basically. And it's realized that the best place for her to be is to go back into the nether realm wherever she was before. And so episode 10, Gentry gets her powers back from Chang so that she can send Xiaolan back where she should belong. In the beginning of that episode, you see a flashback of Mr. Chang, uh, right after he lost his daughter, when he was human, trying to bring her back hundreds of years ago. And I bring in a melody during that flashback to really emphasize his sadness. It is on the erhu in particular, that string instruments that I mentioned. And it's used in a very solitary, very sad way in that opening. And I knew that I wanted to bring that melody back at the end of the episode when Gentry has succeeded and Xiaolan is now going back to where she should be. Um, and so I knew I had that melody, and then when I saw and felt the way that the scene was moving, and when I started scoring it, I realized that the Joe Hisaishi part of my influences was really going to come into play here, because there's no talking during the scene. It's a lot of Gentry using her magic and opening up a portal, Shaolan rising into it. All the other characters in the show are watching on and they're kind of in awe of it. So I knew it was a spot where I could really let a melody sing, where nobody was going to bother me. No sound design, no talking was going to bother me. It was just me telling the story. And you don't get those that often in film scoring. You really have to search them out and cherish them when they come. And so, yeah, I took that erhu melody, I kept it in the erhu, but then I filled out all the orchestration behind it to really make it this sort of lush string section with a little bit of synth work that I had done earlier just to make sure that it all kind of tied together. But yeah, I just let that melody play out. And me being a pianist, I was like, I'm also gonna let the piano sing a little bit here. So I kind of have the piano have the last word in a very, I want to say, Spirited Away kind of vibe. Because I love that score and I've listened to that score, I don't know, maybe more than I've listened to any other score. And there's a really nice lightness to all the piano work in it that's both sad and childlike at the same time. And I really wanted to hit that vibe. And so, yeah, I'm so glad that you like that piece of music. When I was writing that, I spent a lot of time on that piece of music, not because it's a long scene, it's not that long, but just because I really wanted to make sure I hit those beats that I wanted to hit and that that orchestration was like really, really on point. So yeah, man, I'm glad you liked it because I really liked making that one.
So the instrument that you mentioned, and then you mentioned several times that I'm not going to try to pronounce because I know I'm going to get it wrong.
Mhm.
There's an instrument that I'm very curious about in the Great Beyond piece. It's at around the minute 28-second mark, where
Mhm.
it can't it sounds like a little bit almost like a violin, but not quite. I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure out what it is, or if that's one of the instruments that you've mentioned that I'm not familiar with that's being
Yeah.
used at that point.
Yeah, that is the erhu. In English, it's spelled ERHU. And it is similar to a violin in the way that it is built. Has fewer strings, and is built in a way that is really good for pitch bending and pitch sliding. And so I knew that that was the instrument that I wanted to have in that moment because I liked its kind of mournful, lonely quality. I didn't know any erhu players, but I asked around, and there is another composer. Her name is Hannah Zhang, and she is both she's a composer, orchestrator, conductor, and erhu player. And so I found her through friends of friends of friends, and shot her an email and was like, "I have this project that I'm working on now. I think you would be really great on it. Please, I hope you are available, that you can do this for me." And for me, that was also very convenient because her being a composer and an instrumentalist, she already has all the gear. She knows how this works. And so, yeah, she said yes. She was super interested in it. She liked the sound of the project and the pieces of music that I was playing for her. And so, yeah, I could just send her the tracks just with the erhu muted and just send her the written out parts that I would make on my system. And then I'd just be like, yeah, make it sound good. And so yeah, she spent a couple days on it and sent me back just really beautiful playing. She plays more in the next episode, actually, the one where they go down to DU, the Chinese version of Hell. We wanted that to sound super atonal and weird and uncomfortable, and so I sent her some screenshots from that episode and was just like, take the Erhu, turn your mic on record, and just play the ugliest things that you can think of. Just for like, just take an hour, charge me an hourly rate, just like go wild. Just do whatever it is that you're gonna want. I don't even want to direct you on what it is. I just want to show you what it is. You're a film composer, a very talented composer in your own right, and a very good Erhu player. I trust you to make something really weird. Yeah, and she sent me just like dozens upon dozens of these incredible sounds that I would then just cut in into the next episode, into episode 11, that I think really gave it a very specific flavor. I'd never worked with Erhu before. I'd never worked with an Erhu player before. So it was really cool to be able to have these very cool recordings that I think were really unique.
Now, my memory of string instruments, and once again, as a novice, the range of sound usually from higher to lower. You have the violin, viola, you go eventually to the cello, and then
Mhm.
range of lowness. The air flute sounds like it's even lower than the cello. Am I correct on that?
No, I think the Erhu is I think in terms of where it's written on a scale, I think it would probably be in like the violin viola range, but I think because of this like really, what's the good adjective to describe how it is? The only adjective I can think of is woolliness to it, which is like a really weird adjective to describe how a string instrument sounds. But there is like this kind of fuzzy, uh, mid-ranginess to it that I think for you, I think it's pulling it down into a lower range than where I think it actually sits, which is like a really interesting thing that can happen. It can play the exact same note as a violin, like literally the exact same note on the scale, but just because of the way the instrument is built, it's going to give this kind of like darker undercurrent to it that I think is going to pull your ear in this direction where you're going to think, oh, this is a much lower instrument than a violin, when it's actually like pretty comparable.
Oh, wow,
But that's a
okay.
funny trick that the frequencies are playing on you.
Yeah, that's it. Because I think I was like, it feels lower, but that's interesting. Okay, that's actually a fascinating aspect of it, and I think it's also interesting how that instrument just has, as you mentioned, that good quality for that little horror aspect. That the
Mhm.
violin is often, there's usually used for either kind of little sadder music. It's been
Mhm.
also used. I've heard it, be used very kinetically as well. But
Mhm.
it usually have like you don't think of violin as horror in that same kind of
Mhm.
way. But
Mhm.
interesting that the area that you're mentioning does that. It's like the horror version of the violin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you think of any sort of violin use in horror, I think you think of like Psycho. I think like that's the sound, like that sort of like really harsh biting sound. I think a
Yeah.
violin is really brilliant at. But with the Erhu, I just wanted it to be weird, like really weird. And so I think there was something also because it's not used in that context very often. There aren't a whole lot of horror scores based around the Erhu, and so. I think even just asking it to do that, when I received the sounds, at first I didn't know what to do with them because like they didn't really fit in like a traditional orchestration idea and they hadn't there was no real comparable sound to what I was using them for. And so it took a bit of experimentation because if you don't have a reference point, you're just kind of guessing of where things are going to go.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I think that too really makes it sound unusual and unique.
And I think another part of the piece of, like I said, in the Great Beyond that piece,
Hmm.
um, I thought it a lot of it not only is the pieces that the notes you're using, but
Hmm.
the amount kind of like lingered on a notes. That little
Hmm.
extra extension to these notes was actually fascinating, and it
Hmm.
added so much richness and sadness to it. So can you kind
Hmm.
of break that down just a little bit? Because at least that's how when I was listening to it, I just felt like it just held that lingered on that notes longer than you would often hear for musical scores.
Yeah, oh, thank you. I think when I'm working with a scene that has a little bit of dialogue or a little bit of things that I'm kind of working around. I did say that the scene in general doesn't have very much. It really lets me sing, but there are a couple of spots where I have to just get out of the way, maybe for half a second, just to let something else happen, a piece of sound design or this one line or that sort of thing. And I really try to build that in musically. So I'm not just abruptly ending a phrase or stopping a phrase that doesn't make any sense. And I'll try to insert those pauses in a place where hopefully people react the way that you react, where it feels like the music is breathing a little bit,
Hmm.
or just letting a thought linger for an extra half a second or two. And so sometimes it's influenced by that. Sometimes it is influenced by just okay. This is a weird way to answer the question. Whenever I write something, I often will listen to it again the next day, first thing in the morning, because for some reason, when I sit down and haven't written anything else that day, and I sit down and I listen to something, I get a better sense of whether it's too fast or too slow or too busy or not busy enough. And so I think for In the Great Beyond, when I wrote it, because I cared so much about it, I did that process a couple of times where I would listen to it the first thing in the morning before I did anything else. And there's always this idea that I have in my head of I'm going to bring in another random thing. This is all going to come together, I promise. Where I
Sure.
remember I was getting dressed for a wedding once, and I felt like I had too much on. And a friend of mine was like, "Oh, Coco Chanel always used to say, get dressed and then take one thing off, and then you are done." And so, like, that's sort of how I was looking at it during this process of like, okay, I have all these ideas in there, what can I take away to make sure that that balance is perfect? And so when I would listen to In the Great Beyond first thing in the morning, I was always very conscious of maybe taking something away is going to be better than adding something onto it.
Hmm.
And I don't remember the things that I took away or added during the process of it, but there's that sort of magical hour of like, between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. in the morning where I'm doing this process on what I wrote the day before, where I think that balance really finds itself. And
Hmm.
so hopefully I think that is what gave it the flow that you seem to be responding to of the starting and the stopping and the waiting and the pausing and just really making the music feel alive in that way.
I thought that was brilliant. Another piece I really like, which I felt in some ways it was like a counterpoint to In the Great
Yeah.
Beyond, and it may not be, but once again, it's just how my brain's working, listening to it, and
Mhm.
the other piece that I really liked was called Goo Goo Returns. And I
Yes.
thought that was such a brilliant piece. And it's and while there's that sadness and that lingering in the Great Beyond, there's a
Mhm.
kinetic and it's such a kinetic energy
Yeah.
to Google Returns I thought was absolutely fascinating. So
Yeah.
can you kind of go over how you created that piece?
Yeah, that one I actually created with I had a co-composer do a few minutes per episode. His name is Theron Kay. He's credited on the episodes and on the soundtrack as well. And he worked with me on that one. That was one of his assignments. And what we really wanted to make sure was that as we went from that's two different action scenes happening simultaneously. One of them is Gentry and Michael fighting on Earth, and then there's another action sequence of Stella and Ed, and eventually Gugu fighting in DU, where the monsters and hell is all happening. And so when we were figuring it out, it was we wanted to make sure that we were able to differentiate between the two scenes, but never lose momentum. Because if you start an idea and then stop that idea when you go to the new scene, then it feels very choppy. And it was a very continuous, like minute and a half of action that was cutting in between two locations. And so it was important for us to keep that tempo going, and then also to use our themes appropriately. So there's a theme that we used in particular for characters from DU, and so we wanted to make sure that when that theme came in, it was going to be at the peak of that fight. So there's a moment where it looks like Ed and Stella are going to die because they're both being strangled by a creature in DU. And so we really let that theme sing right there at its highest, most intense point, right before Google comes in and saves them and slices that monster clean in half. And so the placement of that theme was also really important. And also, yeah, it's hard when you're doing an action scene that has so many intricate beats to it because you have to really decide, I'm going to hit that beat and I'm going to ignore that beat. Because if you hit every single beat, then it kind of sounds like, and this is not a knock against it, it kind of sounds like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. Tom and Jerry cartoons are so difficult to score. I mean, there's a lot that you have to work on there. I scored one in graduate school and it was so hard. So there's like a huge amount of respect for that style of scoring. But if you do that in a show like Gentry, it's gonna feel out of place, you know? And so there's a really cool spot where Gentry opens a portal and the demon she is fighting falls through the portal and then shoots out of this or then shoots back up out of it like the way because she knew that that portal was going to bounce the person back, and so she does that and the being then shoots into the air and then Gentry flies up and then like does a power punch in the air, and upon first viewing that really seemed like something that we would want to like highlight in the music. But when we were looking at it where it actually fell in the scene, it actually didn't make sense to highlight it, and it actually just meant basically to play through it, you know. So when I was spotting the scene, I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely gonna do something crazy there. But then we realized that if we did something crazy there, it disrupted the flow. And so those are the decisions that you have to make when you're doing a really intricate action scene like that. And yeah, that's one of my favorite action sequences in the show too. It's so complicated, but it really comes to a cool climax.
Now, is it violins and synthesizers that's being used in that?
Mostly that, yeah, it's a combination of strings and synthesizers. There's a lot of percussion too, like so much percussion.
So when you deciding to use the instruments and when did you how are you deciding to use the synthesizers?
That's just like whatever the moment calls for. I
Okay.
don't think like a real plan when we go in and we're like, this is gonna be this is gonna be that. Sometimes it's just like, especially because there's so much music in the episode, and sometimes we have to do them pretty quick, and it's just like sometimes we are just it's just gut instinct, you know. But you know that also comes from we were at episode 13 at that point. You know, I'd had 12 episodes to build up the palette up until there, so we knew the sort of core elements that we could use that would feel like they were in the score. And then when you get to the big climactic moments like that, it's just like, yeah, just pull everything you can, just whatever's gonna work. Yeah.
Like I said, Jentry Chau versus Underworld, it was a brilliant score. I really liked it. It's a
Thank
great
you.
show. And for the listeners, you can find it on iTunes and I imagine every other
Everywhere. Yeah, it's streaming
distributor
everywhere. Yeah.
possible. So what's next for you?
I am well, Gentry, the score for Gentry, right before the holiday was nominated for an Annie Award, and so that's very exciting for me. I have that coming. The award ceremony is in like a month or so, and so I want to make sure that, you know, people know about it. and that if they get to the voting process at the end of January, they've heard it and they know what all the thought and the love that went into it. So I'll be working on that. In terms of actual scoring work, I'm on season 2 of My Life with the Walter Boys right now, which is another Netflix project that I really love. That is like diametrically opposed to what Gentry is. Like that's a very sort of warm, fuzzy, lo-fi vibe. And so that's a really cool change after having been in the world of Gentry for like, the past couple of years. So I'm doing that. And then I have a couple of documentary projects that I started during the writer strikes that are going to be coming out probably in the next couple of months or so. And so, yeah, it's a busy time right now. I'm really, really grateful for it. It's all work that I really love and with crews that I really love. And I think what more could you ask for beyond that, you know?
Well, like I said, I recommend to my listeners to buy your score. It was brilliant, Mr. Kim. It was an honor to speak with you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Have a fantastic night.
You too, as well. Bye bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Verted Stars Podcast. Please like and subscribe. Turn for the next episode when Katie Lee boards the mothership to discuss the adventures of the gummy bears, Muppet Babies, and Darkwing Duck. The next voyage, travel on.